Welcome back to this news presentation as part of the Yahowah blog. I am your host, Craig Wynn, and it is with a very heavy heart that I speak to Israel today. I have read just in the last few minutes that what I thought was an abomination, a complete capitulation on behalf of Israel, that they were compelled by Donald Trump, a man that they thought they could trust, who strong-armed Benjamin Netanyahu, compelling him, according to the Muslims and Arab leaders that were privy to Trump's tactics, into surrendering to Islamic terrorism. And that the initial rumor was that 33 alive, innocent Israeli civilians who were mercilessly kidnapped by Islamic jihadists on 10/7/23 were going to be traded for 1,248 convicted Islamic terrorists, which is the only reason they kidnapped them in the first place. Which means that with that kind of capitulation, Israel was compelled into rewarding the Islamic terrorists for the crime that they committed, which is why Muslims were celebrating everywhere. But it isn't even that favorable. 23 living hostages, innocent civilians, these mostly women and children, kidnapped by the ruthless terrorist thugs representing Muhammad, Allah, and Islam that were so vicious on 10/7/23, are being returned and traded. When you negotiate with the devil, you bring nothing but evil upon yourself. There is nothing to be gained and everything to be lost. This was a complete capitulation, Israel. You committed suicide. And yet, Trump announced that the hostages were coming home. Oh, great celebration. Bull. I predicted that Trump would do this to Israel, that because they trusted a narcissist who has only one goal in life, and that is his own self-aggrandizement, that he would sell Israel out. And ultimately, this was only the first of many phases, because the next phase is he's going to force Israel to forfeit its very heart by accepting a terrorist state carved out of its midst, because he wants to earn a Nobel Peace Prize for normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia, and that's what they want. Israel, you committed suicide. You allowed the 800 or so IDF soldiers who gave their lives fighting in Gaza, you made it so that they gave their lives in vain. Rather than protecting Israel, you made it infinitely more vulnerable. Have you learned nothing from all of the trades that you have made with Islamic terrorists previously? Do you not know what happened the last time you played this game? Oh, what's really sad is that I predicted that this would occur. And I predicted it on the morning of 10/7. I knew how Israel would respond, and I knew what the result would be. And so what I'm sharing with you now, and this is part 2 of my open letter to Israel. It's called At War with Religion. It was published in the opening volume of Goddamn Religion. That is here. The opening volume is called Snake. This happens to be volume 2. There are 5 of these volumes, 4,200 pages of documentation, all from the oldest and most credible Islamic sources that expose and condemn the Islamic religion and explain exactly why they cut through the fence into Israel, while they celebrated what they were going to do, why they raped little girls and women, and then desecrated them by mutilating their breasts and genitals. And then while they were still living, they tortured them and burned them alive. They did the same thing to little children. They made their parents watch as they tortured children. They were savages. And the savagery, the butchery that occurred on 10/7 was to such an extent, it was only possible as an expression of a religion. Where in Islam, these boys and men were fooled by a false prophet and a false God into believing that if they go off and kill Jews, rape Jews, mutilate Jews, kidnap Jews, that they, for this disgusting behavior, would be rewarded with a place in Allah's brothel where they will have an unending supply of virgins. And anyone stupid enough to believe there is such a God doesn't deserve the breath that they breathe. And yet, Israel, you just capitulated to them. You just rewarded them for their carnage. I know you were forced into it by Donald Trump, who blackmailed you, and now will be taking credit that he's the great savior, the great redeemer of Israel, the man who released the hostages. Reprehensible Israel. I'm very sad for God's people. Now, on the morning of 10/7/23, I began to write this letter, which I then composed on the next few days, updated it as I added it to Volume 1 of Goddamn Religion. And it's available to read at goddamnreligion.org. You can read the entire letter. You can go to yadayah.com and you can read this entire open letter as well. But I'm also bringing it to you as part of this broadcast. This is the second part. We were in the midst of reading what the third surah says about these kinds of events, so that you might have a better understanding of what Islam and Allah are all about. Now, with Yahowah, his Nabi prophets, they foretell and explain the future. With Allahi, who is misconstrued as Allah, they destroy it. That's what Islam is best at, destruction and death, although it's very good at deceit and damnation. With Yahowah, his Nabi prophets excoriate the religious, while Allah loves the religious because they are his slaves and they do his bidding, although his bidding is horrendous. Quran 3:146. And many a prophet fought in Allah's cause, and along with him large bands of religious leaders, but they never lost heart because they did not become weak on account of what befell them in the way of Allahi. They were never weakened or disgraced, and they never gave in. Allah, who loves the steadfast. He's bragging about killers. 3:147. And there were no words except they said, Rabbi, which is the rabbis and Yathrib, when they sold Muhammad, stories from their Talmud convinced the nincompoop Muhammad that Rabbi was the word for Lord, when that is just not true. But nonetheless, they believe it in Islam. Rabbi, forgive our sins and excuses in our affairs and make our feet firm, giving us victory over people who do not believe. He's calling them to war against all humankind. Jewish rabbis left an indelible mark on Islam. Well, they sold Muhammad the Talmud stories that he bastardized to create the majority of his Quran. But also, Allah's title is Rabbi, my Lord. And the religious leaders are rabbi. There is to be no excuse for Islam for fighting. So in Islam, if you are not fighting, you do not have an alibi, not from Allah. So Muslims will fight to the death or to victory. And they are told to never give up, never retreat. So they will die because they obey the vicious voice of the Quran. 3:149 and 150. O you who believe, if you obey, those who disbelieve will retreat, and they will not, and you will not retreat as losers. This is a call to arms. This is promising Muslims that they fight to the death, that the whole world will capitulate to them. And we will cast ruba, terror, into the hearts of the disbelievers because they associate partners and friends and co-workers with Elohi, which is contrary to what he sent down under his authority. So their refuge will be the fire, the evil, wretched abode for disbelievers. Did you hear that, Israel? The Islamic God, Allah, said he will cast terror into the hearts of all who disbelieve in Islam. Allah is admitting that he himself is a terrorist. You can't fix that. That means that the terrorists in Islam are not radical Muslims. They're following Allah's example and his orders and Muhammad's example and orders. Allah said, we will cast ruba, terror, into the hearts of the disbelievers. Because, well, Allah has to be alone. He can have no partners, no friends, no co-workers. That's contrary to what he sent down, which makes him contrary to Yahweh, because Yahweh does everything through co-workers. So their refuge, after you kill them, Muslims, Allah wants you to know, Muslims, that Allah is going to be a terrorist because he promises that he is going to torture physical bodies of those that Muslims have butchered in hell. According to Allah, all of the 1,200 Jews that were massacred on 10/7, they're in hell with Allah himself presiding over their tortures. Now, fortunately, Allah is no more God than camel spit. But it doesn't change the fact that Muslims believe this demon, and they fight and kill for him. Now, you're getting some clue as to what you're up against. The problem isn't Hamas. It's not Hezbollah. It's not Islamic Jihad. It's not Iran. It's not Qatar. It's not even Saudi Arabia. The problem is Islam. The problem is the Quran. The problem is Muhammad. It's the Hadith. You are fighting a war against a religion. And if you don't recognize you're fighting the war against a religion, the religion sure as hell knows that they're fighting this war against you. And they declared war on you 1,400 years ago. They annihilated every Jew in Arabia. They raped the women. They enslaved the children. They robbed them of their lands. This is as clear as the swastika was on a Nazi killer. Muslims terrorized because Allah was a terrorist. Those who believe anything contrary to this destructive diatribe, who ascribe anything to Allah apart from what he claims in the Quran, are dispatched to the wretched abode of the fire. I don't suppose that squares well with the moderate Muslim modality of apologists and progressives. Nonetheless, the promise of Islam is death. Quran 3:151. And with certainty, Allah who fulfilled his promise to you when you were killing them with his permission. May I read that again to you? Quran 3:151. And with certainty, Allah who promised to you when you were killing them with his permission, until you lost courage and then you fell into a dispute over the order and you disobeyed the command to kill after he had shown you that you really love it. Among you are those who desire the world, and among you are those who desire the hereafter. So then he diverted you from them so that he may test you, and surely he forgives you. And Allah, who? The bounty possessor for believers. I know that's gobbledygook. Allah tossed word saddles throughout the Quran. You know, he was no more intelligent than his illiterate non-prophet. But what he's saying here is that Muslims turned tail, that they were ordered to be killers, and that when they were killers, Allah allowed them to massacre non-Muslims with his permission. Then they lost courage. They got in a little dispute. What the dispute was, they recognized Muhammad was lying through his teeth. And Muhammad was nothing but a coward. They recognized Muhammad was a pedophile and a rapist. And they don't really make good prophets. And so they recognized also that they were killing their own family members. They didn't like it very much. So Allah is scolding them and telling those who lost their courage to fight and who decided that, maybe we don't want to kill our moms and our dads and our sons and our brothers, that those who lost their desire to engage in jihad and Allah's cause, which is killing for him, that they are those who desire the world, and they're going to be tortured. And it's only those who buy into the stupidity that rapists and mass murderers go to heaven. Those are the only ones that Allah is going to forgive. Allah who has great bounty for the believers, says the snake in the desert. Well, this is reminiscent of October 7th and the aftermath in Gaza. Muslims were keen on killing Jews, even celebrated their dismemberment and death. But they weren't as excited by the prospect of being held accountable and quickly played, I'm a victim. Second only to the Lord himself, who is Satan, Satan, the adversary, plays the most invasive and compelling role in the Quran. And that is because Satan is the side of Allah that the Lord of delusions wants to both deploy and deny. That is why this slip-up is quickly forgiven. Quran 3, 155 and 156. Lo, verily, those who retreated among you that day met the two forces, and Shaitan, the adversary, Satan, made them slip up from what they had earned. So surely Allah who forgave them. Yeah, there you go. And you join forces with Satan. Well, that's forgivable in Islam. No problem. Quran 3, 156. O you who believe, be not like those who disbelieve, the infidels, the hypocrites, who say to their brethren when they travel in the earth or go out to fight, if they had stayed with us, they would not have died or be killed. So Allah who makes his cause a regret in their hearts. It is Allah who gives life and causes death. He is the all-seer of what you do. The infidels he's talking about here, they're not the enemies of Islam. They were Muslims, but they were peaceful Muslims who did not want to fight and kill. And so from Allah's perspective, any Muslim who isn't a jihadist becomes a hypocrite. He is the worst form of infidel. And Allah tells the good Muslims to kill them so he can attend to their tortures in hell. Quran 3, 157. If you are killed or die in the way of Allah, forgiveness and mercy from Allah are far better than what they amass. And if you die and are killed, verily unto Allah you will be gathered. That's true, but not in the way they think it to be so. I have said thousands of times, Islam is a death cult. That's what Allah just said. It is Allah who gives you life and causes your death. And if you are killed or die in the way of Allah, oh, mercy and forgiveness, death is the thing to be celebrated. They're far better to die killing for Allah than it is to live and be successful. Whether you die or are killed, verily unto you, you will be gathered unto Allah. Die, Muslim, die. It is the duty of Allah's slaves. But before you go, be sure to steal something. Quran 3:161. It is not for any prophet to embezzle a part of the gul, the booty, illegally withholding the spoils of war. And whoever deceives his companions as regards to the booty, he shall bring it forth on the day of resurrection, that which he took illegally. Then every person shall be paid in full for what he has earned, and they shall not be dealt with unjustly. He just said, you go off and embezzle. You take the booty. But if you take the booty, you got to share it with Allah. Because Allah's really broke all the time. So go ahead and take all the booty you want. Actually, in the 8th surah, it says the spoils of war are lawful and good. Stealing in Islam is sanctified. It is celebrated. But when you steal, make certain that Allah gets his share of the booty you stole. As for Resurrection Day, it's the dumbest idea in the world. This idea that physical bodies are going to be resurrected so they can be tempted in Allah's brothel with multiple virgins or forever tortured in Allah's hell. Total nonsense. Anybody that has an ounce of understanding of the difference between energy and physical bodies and the limitations of physical bodies and the decay of a physical body knows that it is total and complete nonsense. But the religious eat it up. They're easily tantalized or frightened. In Islam, stealing is lawful and good, as Muhammad has practiced, and now as Israel no doubt noted during the recent terrorist raid. But it isn't good for the non-prophet to steal what was stolen from the stealers. But if he does, it's no big deal, because they will all square up once they reach the raunchy brothel in the sky. Yeah, Islam is this bad. The Quran is this twisted and immoral. In this next statement, there is the propensity among Muslim translators to render al-Jamani, the two hosts, as more favorable and as one being more formidable than the other, such as two armies. However, that would be inaccurate, since Muhammad's Muslims only terrorized civilian targets. They never tangled with anyone's military. Not even a militia. They attacked civilians. And in this particular case, the terrorists were thumped by some aging merchants. This is what was witnessed on October 7th, 23. The Islamic militants were all huffy and heroic when gunning down and raping little girls, old ladies, and babies. But when the idea finally showed up, they ran and hid under the dresses of their women and among the toys of their children. Quran 3:166. And what you suffered and what struck you on this day of the two hosts as the forces met was by the permission of Allah, in order that he may test the believers. Yeah, sure, you were knocked on your keister and you lost. But it was all Allah's plan. Yep, when you go off and fight, he's not maybe as competent as he claims to be. So he has an excuse for everything. Yeah, you lost that battle. It was your fault. When you're a really good terrorist, then I'm going to take credit for that. For a religion which appeals to those with IQs in the sub-70 range, which is the average IQ in Gaza, who are as ignorant as they are immoral, there are lots of tests. And I wonder who is grading them, because it's clear that without them, Allah wouldn't know a Muslim from a date palm. But this we know for sure. Allah is mandating fighting and death. This is the furthest thing from a spiritual struggle. Further, those being tested are Muslims, And the purpose is to weed out and discharge the peaceful ones because they're hypocrites whom Allah hates. Quran 3:167. And that he might test and make evident who are the hypocrites, peaceful Muslims. It was said to them, come, fight in the way of Allah or defend. And they said, had we known that the fighting was taking place and knew how to fight, we would certainly have followed you. But they were that day nearer to disbelief than faith, saying with their mouths which was not in their hearts, and Allah who has full knowledge of what they conceal. Did you hear that? Progressives, are you listening? Are you capable of understanding this? Allah is saying that if you do not fight for him, if you do not kill for him, then you are a hypocrite who has lost their faith. And that Allah knows the hypocrites. He's going to judge them, condemn them, and torture them forever. That is a moderate Muslim, because in the Quran, all good Muslims are killers. Don't think so. Read the Quran. I'm reading it to you. Quran 3:168. They are the ones who said about their killed brethren, why they themselves sat at home. If only they had listened to us, they would not have been killed. Say, avert death from your own selves if you speak the truth. So Allah's answer for those Muslims, the followers of Muhammad, the very first Muslims, those who heard the Quran drip from his disgusting lips, knew that killing was wrong. They knew that slaughtering their children and their parents and their brothers and sisters for money was wrong, and they didn't want to do it. So Allah is lambasting them, said, you can't be a Muslim unless you are willing to fight and kill for me all the time without excuse. And just because some people didn't die that day and those who fought for me did die, don't you cop an attitude and pretend like those who didn't die because they didn't go off killing for me are somehow better. That's the mentality of Allah. He's the merchant of death. Quran 3:168. They are the ones who said about their killed brethren while they sat at home, if only they had listened to us, they would not have died. But Allah said, yeah, see if you can avert death. You speak the truth. 3:169. Think not of those who were killed in the way of Allah as dead. And hey, they're alive with their Rabbi Lord, and they have provision. This God was so demonic, so sinister. He told Muslims, and they actually believe him, that if they die in Allah's cause, they're not dead. They can go kill, butcher, mutilate, steal, torture in Allah's cause, and Allah will reward them with a wonderful provision. That's how sadistic this book is, how demonic this God is. That's what it says. Don't pretend otherwise. Those are killed in the way of Allah, fighting for Allah. Though they're alive with their Rabbani, their Lord, and they have provision. 3:170. Rejoicing in what Allah who has bestowed upon them of his bounty. They receive good tidings about those who have not yet joined them, but are left behind, not yet martyred, that on them there shall come no grief nor fear. It's a declaration of war on all humankind. Allah is telling Muslims that the only way out of this world alive is to die. And you must die killing others for him. The only reward in Islam is to die as a murderer. That is the message of the Quran. And don't deny it. Muslims know it. And if you don't know your enemy, Israel, you'll continue to lash out at symptoms. What I predicted, Israel, that you would invade Gaza and that you would lash out and kill thousands of Islamic militants as this notion that you were obliterating Hamas. And what I told you months before you invaded, on 10/7 and 10/8 of 23, is that for every Islamic terrorist that you kill, you will manufacture at least 2 more. And now the news out of Gaza is that there are more Hamas militants there now than there were on 10/7. Israel has killed 20,000, and there are some 40 to 60,000. Perhaps a whole lot more. This is what happens when you don't know your enemy. When you lash out at symptoms and you think that you can eradicate Hamas. It's impossible. You could kill everyone in Gaza and you still wouldn't kill the ideology that sought your annihilation. Hamas is but a symptom. Quran 3:170. Rejoicing in Allah who has bestowed upon them his bounty. Rejoicing as murderers. And they receive good tidings about those who have not yet joined them, but are left behind, not yet martyred, that they shall have no fear. They shall come and they shall not grieve. Acts that would send souls to hell in any sane religion send the murderers and the rapists and the thieves, the torturers and the terrorists to heaven. Islam is incompatible with human decency. There are 2 reasons why Muslims are continually commanded to fight in Allah's cause. First, as Satan, Allah is as competent as your average reptile. He needs Muslims to kill for him since he can't do it himself. And second, Satan created Islam to dispense with humanity, to subjugate and kill everyone. You see, Satan must kill all who do not surrender and submit to him for him to prevail. Because Allah is Satan, and if he does not kill every Jew, if he does not cause the world to surrender and capitulate to him, then when Yahweh returns with the Messiah Dod on October 2nd, the day of reconciliation, Yom Kippurim, in 2033 or 6,000 Yah, and it's all over for Satan. He's dispatched to hell. This is his end game. Islam is his principal tool. If Muslims were to prevail and kill all non-Muslims on the planet, disposing of some, 6 billion souls, the following day they would start killing one another until there were none. But not to worry. According to the ungod who isn't able to kill without the help of jihadists, he has promised to bring them back to life. However, since killing is easy and reviving is difficult, it would be unwise to count on this reversal of fortune. When religions tell the faithful to suffer and die in this life for reward in the next, believers are being defrauded on both accounts. It has never happened, and it will never occur. And without this bogus bill, there is no Islam. The same is true with donations to the religious establishment. By the way, Quran 3:172. And those who answered the call of Lillahi and the Rasuli, the messenger, after being wounded, for those of them who did good deeds and feared, there is a great reward. Oh, it takes more than doing what Allah commands and following Muhammad's, the messenger's, order and being wounded. You also need to fear. But didn't he just say there's no fear on those who are really good killers? Maybe he had a lapse in judgment. He wasn't writing any of this down, and sometimes it's really hard to remember. Snakes have really puny little brains. Sometimes they say a short pencil is better than a long memory. Well, Allah didn't have one. But those who said to them, the people, verily, the people certainly gathered against you, so fear them. But it increased in them faith, and they said, Allahu sufficient for us, and he is the best disposer of affairs, including all lives. wealth, prosperity, freedom. He's really good at getting rid of stuff. Now, this is typical of the Quran. Neither of the belligerents have been named. The place, time, and circumstances associated with this call to arms and to one's death were not disclosed. And this is because Allahu isn't a fan of context or chronology, much less literacy, intelligible communications. They weren't his strong suit either. And by the way, I have rendered these statements from the Quran word-by-word translation, which is the most respected, the most literal, the most accurate in the world today. Returning to the most important character in the Quran after the Rabbi and the Rasul, we re-encounter Al-Shaitan, Satan. Yep. Quran 3:175. Only Al-Shaitan, the adversary, Satan, frightens his supporters and friends, so fear them not, but fear me, if you are believers. He is having a real tough time with fear. No fear if you're a good killer, but you better fear me. No fear, but fear. Fear Satan. No, fear Satan, fear me. No, don't feel Satan because, well, Satan is my alter ego, but you better fear me if you're a believer. Great, huh? A fearsome God that champions killing for him, who rewards killers, who punishes the peaceful. Well, since Al-Shaitan, the adversary, and Allahu both induce compliance through fear, since they both insist on amassing fighters, and since they share the same agenda throughout the Quran and share speaking roles throughout the Quran, what distinguishes them? Also, since it is important to properly convey just how inarticulate this rabbi, this Lord, actually was, here is another literal word-for-word rendering of the "kill for me or I torture you" surah. Quran 3:176. And not grieve you, those who hastily rush in disbelief. Lo, verily, they never will harm for her anything intends thee for him, that not he will set for them any portion in the hereafter, and for them a great tormenting punishment. If that's your God, then you are as dumb as he is. Lo, verily, those who purchase disbelief with the faith, never will they harm thee for her anything, and for them a punishment painful. Yeah, well, Allah claims to be really good at two things. Terror, well, three. Terror, death, and punishing. Terror, death, and punishing. Those are the skill sets of the snake that brought us the Quran. Quran 3:178. And do not think, those who disbelieved, that we gave respite to them good for themselves, in quotes or in parentheses, i.e., that our postponing of their punishment is good for them, end of parenthetical. Only we postpone to them so that they may increase sins, and for them a humiliating punishment and disgraceful torment. So Allah said, listen, okay, we all know I'm completely inept. I can't do shit or shinola. I can't even roll over as the rock of the Kaaba. I can't do anything. There isn't a single thing that I have actually accomplished in my entire existence other than what I claimed that Yahweh actually did because, well, I like to pretend I'm him. And so he says, just because they were not punished right away, which I promised that I was going to do, don't worry, because I actually postponed their punishment, not because I'm inept or incompetent. I postponed it so they could increase in their sins, because I wanted them to increase in their sins so I could humiliate them and punish them forevermore. Can't wait to be a good torturer. and the fires of hell were. By the way, Allah spends all of his time in the Quran. When Allah claims that he is unfazed by the refusal of some Muslims to fight, of course he's lying. The same is true of his excuse for postponing their punishment. To prevail in his plan to be worshipped as God, Satan has to discourage Yahweh from returning as planned on Yom Kippurim, the day of reconciliations in 2033, year 6000 Yah. And for that to occur, every Jew on earth must either capitulate to Allah or die. Since Allah can do nothing on his own, he must convince Muslims, his slaves, to murder Jews for him. And he's really good at that. While at the same time, moving the goalposts on his day of doom, since he can't bring it about. But time runs out. 9 years to this date. 10 years from the day of October 7th. Actually, 10 years exactly to the day of October 7th, 2023 to October 7th, 2033. It is a Shabat, also in 2033, and the beginning of the end for Hasatan and the commencement of Sukkah, camping out with God for 1,000 years. That is the future. That is when this will all come to a crashing halt. I hope you are there with me and not on the wrong side. Therefore, since Jews are still alive and free, Allah must explain away the delay in subjugating and annihilating them. Quran 3, 196. Let not the freedom of movement and strutting about of those who disbelieve in the land deceive you. 197. It is a trifling, short-lived enjoyment. Then their abode, hell, a wretched bed and resting place. 199. Lo, verily, among the people, the book, who believed in Allah and what was revealed to you and what was revealed to them, humbling themselves in submission and subjugation to the God. They do not sell, bartering away the verses of Allah for a small price and trifling gain. For them, their reward is with their Rabbi Lord. Lo, verily, Allah, swift in settling the account. Maybe you were confused. I know that he speaks gibberish, but I have spent so much time translating the Quran and understanding it because, well, I've spent the last 23 years translating Hebrew, and most of the Quran was actually written in bastardized Hebrew, which we call Arabic today. And I've gotten to know this beast really well. So here's what he said. He didn't have a book. There was no Quran. Not a single page, not a single word, not a single letter, nothing of the Quran existed during Muhammad's lifetime or in almost 10 decades thereafter. So there was no book. But there was an actual book because the rabbis were reading it to Muhammad. And so what Allah was saying here is that he is the one who revealed that other book. I know I don't have a book. I know there's no Quran, but trust me on this, fellas. I actually revealed the other book. I don't know its name. I don't know any of the characters. I can't keep any of the stories straight. I'm contradicting myself on all possible occasions, and there is no comparison to what the Quran says and what that other book says. But nonetheless, I want you to suspend reason and believe me that I'm the one who inspired that other book. That, oh, by the way, is only known to me and Muhammad because rabbis read passages from it for money. And that's what Allah here is all upset about. He wants to subdue and subjugate those who sold, bartered away the verses which Allah now wants to claim for himself that were recited at a price by the rabbis in Yathrib to create the Quran. But now that they are mocking Muhammad, saying, these things didn't come from Allah. We read you these stories and you twisted and bastardized them to the point that they have no sense now and are completely erroneous. And so the swift in reckoning, he cut off their heads. He raped their wives. He sold their children into slavery. Even after having scored a sadistic victory over Jews, even after turning the world against God's people, even in the light of his plans to orchestrate a terrorist attack 100 times more devastating against Israel than what happened on 10/7, Satan is running out of time. Therefore, Quran 3:199 is essential to appreciating Satan's campaign to subjugate Jews that Muslims fail to kill over the decade that he has remaining. He must prevent their return to Yahweh. The ungod was incapable of providing any proof that he was other than Satan. So he had his nonprofit purchase religious citations from the rabbis in Petra and in Yathrib. Then the rabbi of regurgitation claimed that he had been the God who initially revealed them. However, proving otherwise, he twisted them to suit his demonic agenda and Muhammad's pathetic situation. Therefore, the rabbis who had provided them not only mocked the nonprofit over their charade, but when Muhammad stopped paying his bills, they threatened to expose him. To preclude that from occurring, the impoverished, illiterate, and immoral nonprofit, with his ungod's blessing, decided to kill them. But now we're getting slightly ahead of our story. We rejoin the 33rd Surah, Al-Ahzab, the clans, revealed in 628 CE in the Central Arabian Desert. It extols the merits of fighting one's neighbors should they disavow Islamic terrorism. It lambasts peaceful Muslims and demonstrates Allah's disgust for these hypocrites. It says that by renouncing violent Islam, moderate Muslims are hell-bound. As Allah's slaves, they are not allowed to renege on their oath to wage war against all mankind. In keeping with this theme, after inspiring Muslims to fear hell more than dying, fighting for Islam, the 33rd Surah of the Quran abruptly transitions to targeting Jews. Allah supports and rewards stealing Jewish homes, property, women, children, while snuffing out their lives, just as happened on 10/7/23. Evidently dead men tell no tales, but these do. I would not allow their voices to remain silent. That is why I wrote the 5 volumes of Goddamn Religion. I will not allow the Jews who were murdered by the first Muslims to remain silent. I will not allow the 1,200 Jews who were murdered by Muslims on 10/7 to have died in vain. This is the answer. And you need to read it, Israel, if you're going to save your nation from the kind of capitulation that occurred today. This portion of the 33rd Surah closes by putting all Muslims on notice that they have no say in this or any other matter. There can never be freedom in Islam. There can never be a democratic Islamic country. Allah's orders are unambiguous and undeniable. And he commands Muslims to terrorize, plunder, enslave, and annihilate God's people. For those who support the Fakistinians, who lie for them, who accommodate them, who are, we're pro-Palestinian, we're little triangles. Go Fakistinian. Jews are committing genocide. They're colonists. Go kill them. River to the sea. Go to hell. Those who lie for them, you progressive, you utter ridiculously libertards that don't have any gray matter between your ears, have no sense of morality, or completely ignorant and irrational. Those who accommodate these bloodthirsty terrorists are scum. Those who reward them at the expense of Jews are the lowest form of life on the planet. They are the true hypocrites, advocating a state of terror for the terrorists. Islam has played all of you for fools, and since pleading ignorance isn't an alibi, those who side with Muslims against Israel are complicit in the crime of genocide. The very thing you're screaming against, you're guilty of aiding and abetting. Quran 3:33:1. O al-Nabi, Hebrew word, prophet, fear Allah, and do not obey al-Kafir, the disbelievers, or munafuk, wrongdoers and hypocrites. Lo, verily, Allah, all-knower, all-wise. Yeah, but he can't write a complete sentence. Therefore, Muslims are not allowed to pledge their allegiance to any un-Islamic or even moderate Muslim institution, creed, or nation. Muslims are driven by fear and a false sense of superiority to lash out against the world. 33:2. And follow what is inspired to you from your Rabbi Lord. Lo, verily, Allah is all aware of what you do. 33:3. Then put your trust in Allah, and Allah is sufficient disposer of affairs. He disposes of everything worthwhile. The Quran is exceedingly dark, deadly, and demented, even dim-witted and demonic. To be inspired by it is to become similarly diabolical and malignant. Since the voice of the Quran was incapable of doing much of anything, Allah garnered credibility by claiming to be the God of the Bible. Then he used the carrot and stick to incite Muslims, pleading with them to fight for him. 33:7. When we took from the prophets their pledge, and from you, and from Noah, Abraham, and Musa, Moses, and Isa, Jesus, son of Miriam, and we took strong oath and pledge for them. You utter nutbag. Islam was created in the 7th century CE. Noah lived almost 5,000 years ago. Abraham, 4,000 years ago. Moshe wrote the Torah, which is the antithesis of the Quran. And Jesus is a crude counterfeit. He never existed. He's a complete myth. And Esau is actually a transliteration of Esau, the one person Yahweh calls out by name that says, I hate him. There was no Miriam. And I can assure you that Allah didn't even exist at that time. Allah's name didn't appear until centuries thereafter. Bragging is one of Allah's strong suits, as his line. 33:8. That he may ask the truthful about their truth, that he has prepared for the disbelievers a painful torment and grievous punishment. Yes, he is the Lord of painful punishments. Allah spends all of his time in hell. He is hell's warden. Noah, Abraham, and Moshe responded to Yahweh, who engaged accordingly. As for Esau, Jesus, he's a mythical character similar to Odysseus and Dionysus. And yet he was worshipped as the god of many Christians surrounding Muhammad. So I guess he was fair game. I'm going to include him too, because I'm going to pretend that I'm the god of even religions who are completely incompatible with one another, as well as the author of books that denounce religion, like the Torah and the prophets. And matter of fact, Noah, Abraham, and Moshe were special. They were companions of Yahweh. They were co-workers with Yahweh because they denounced religion. Something to think about. The threat of painful punishments is not only for Allah's entertainment, it is the fate predestined for all disbelievers, and of course for moderate Muslims, second only to the 400 iterations of the never-ending argument, which everybody that knew Muhammad better than anyone today, said that you are a lying, plagiarizing, demon-possessed charlatan and a complete fraud. And that argument is played out 1,000 times in the Quran. So all for them and for everyone else, those who knew Muhammad better than anyone today, pain and punishment is the Quran's most foreboding theme. Moving deeper into the surah and the approaching forces were lightly armed members of Muhammad's extended family and former friends who had grown weary of the non-prophet terrorizing them. They had come to hold the first Muslims accountable for armed robbery, kidnapping, and murder. However, as this narrative indicates, during their only defensive battle, this is the only defensive battle of the 75 raids that Muhammad engaged in. He was the aggressor, attacking civilians for money and for slaves and for women to rape and for their means of productivity, their curds and whatever else they owned, on all but one occasion. On the one occasion that he fought a defensive battle, well, he got creamed. But not only that, he fought a defensive battle because the merchants that he had, his own family members, that he had robbed, kidnapped, and murdered, were trying to hold him accountable. So I wouldn't even call it defensive. Muhammad's Muslims were terrified. So Allah allegedly performed his one and only miracle. He blew some hot air that caused some sand to fly around in the desert. Can you imagine that? Blowing sand in the desert. It's a miracle. As is his custom, Allah is expecting Muslims to have read the hadith to know what he is talking about, because without the hadith, none of this makes any sense, which is why I use the hadith to put the Quran into the context of Muhammad's life and reorder it chronologically so it did make sense for the first time. Otherwise, this is a fish out of water, kind of like the creation account, which it's a long story about the one fish, two fish for another day. Nonetheless, as we progress through Muhammad's despicable life, we will discover that his brothers and sisters from Petra, which is where Islam was actually conceived, had more than enough of the non-prophet's shenanigans. He had robbed, raped, terrorized, and murdered them so many times that they sought to end the torment by killing the little snake. Unfortunately, he slithered away, but not before Allah could claim credit for the hole in the sand that stumped his adversaries. It's sort of like Muslims from Gaza go into Israel. They commit unspeakable crimes against Jews. They rape them, they murder them, they torture them, they rob them, and they kidnap them. And then when Jews come to hold them accountable, oh my God, this is terrible. The genocide's been perpetrated on top of us. We're the victims. Well, that's what happened when Muhammad's extended family came back to hold him accountable. And then what's so amazing about Muslims, they get their butts kicked in their only defensive battle. And it was against merchants, mind you, not a militants or a military. And they claim victory. It's just like they're screaming victory. Yesterday they were claiming genocide, and today they're claiming victory because, well, Israel capitulated and rewarded them for the horrors they perpetrated on God's people. However, sometime, those who were stymied by this line drawn in the sand, which is the Battle of the Trench, they managed to come upon the first Muslims from above and below as if they had rockets and, well, built tunnels like Hamas. This shook Allah's little jihadists to the core of their faith. So they had always been the tormentors, and now they were being tormented. Oh my God, they were being held accountable. 33:9. Oh, you who believe, remember the favor of Allah upon you when there came to you the hosts, and we sent down a wind and forces that you saw not, and Allah is the seer of all that you do. Yeah, constantly. Allah claimed that he was the big helper because it was his angels who were the real killers. That you couldn't see them, you didn't see any evidence of them. It was you who really did the killing. But nonetheless, Allah has this whole cadre of killers, and he was the one that was so vicious that day. Well, his killers must not be very good because they got their butts whipped. When they came upon you from above and from below you, and when your eyes grew wild and your hearts reached your throat, and you were harboring doubts and assumptions about Allah, like, what in the world is going on here? We're being held accountable because we were rapists and we were terrorists and we were mass murderers and thieves and kidnappers. And oh my God, I thought our God Allah, who promised us that there would be a reward for these things and that we would always prevail, and you got your butts kicked. And so, yeah, you were harboring doubts. There, the believers were tried and shaken with a mighty shaking. When the hypocrites and those who were filled, hypocrites, those who didn't fight to the death, were filled, Muslims who didn't fight to the death, they're the hypocrites. Moderate Muslims ceased to be Muslims, with doubts and in whose heart was a disease. If you are advancing the notion of moderate Islam, of a moderate Muslim, of the moderation of this religion, understand that Allah just said that those people you're talking about, the lone ungod of Islam, just said are diseased. He called them hypocrites. The promise of Allah and his messenger to us is only a deceitful delusion. They heard the Quran fall from Muhammad's lips, and they knew it was a deceitful delusion. Quran 33:13. And when a party of them said, "O people of Yathrib, no stand for you, so turn back," a group of them sought permission from the prophet, saying, "Lo, our homes are exposed." When they were not exposed, they wished but to flee. This is Allah's Monday morning quarterbacking, if you will. Yeah, okay, you got whooped. It was a really bad scene. It looked like all was lost. But nah, they weren't really exposed. They weren't really here. It was all the fault of you moderate Muslims who wouldn't fight to the death. If they had entered, this is 14, if they had entered upon them from the sides of the city, if they had been extorted to treachery, renouncing Islam, they surely would have done it. They would only have hesitated a little. He's speaking of the folks in Yathrib who were hoodwinked into Islam by Muhammad's lies, and when they confronted reality, and they were paying the price for the torment that they had imposed on others, that they had renounced Islam. Those who actually experienced the reality of Islam in its inception and knew how disgusting it was, renounced the religion. Therefore, a Muslim is considered a diseased hypocrite if they question the Quran, if they cease to obey Muhammad, or they flee from fighting. A peaceful Muslim who refuses to kill for Allah is deemed to have renounced Islam and is seen as a traitor to the faith. That is what the 33rd Surah just revealed. Can you deal with the truth? Why do you have to plead ignorance or lie on behalf of this religion for you to tolerate it? The sworn oath being referenced throughout this is the Pledge of Aqaba. The Pledge of Aqaba was a vow to wage war on all mankind. Pure and simple, that's it. The Pledge of Aqaba is 20 pagans after Muhammad fled Babel in shame, pledged to wage war on behalf of Muhammad against all mankind. It is year one now of the Islamic era. Those first 12 years of total failure in Babel are all forgotten. The Islamic era begins with the Pledge of Aqaba, which is a pledge to wage war against all humankind. It makes Islam a death cult. It occurred in Yathrib 6 years prior to the recital of this surah. And certainly they had already made a sworn oath to Allah. 20 of them did. And that they would not turn their backs to the foe. And is an oath to Allah to be questioned? Say, never will fleeing benefit you if you flee from death or slaughter. And then you will not be allowed to enjoy but a little. In Islam, if you flee from killing, if you flee from death or the slaughter of others, then Allah is onto you, like ugly on a monkey. His goal is for you to die so he can torture you. All Muslims have to fight to the death. They have to fight all the time. They can never turn their backs. Why do they hightail it back to Gaza, I wonder? Yeah. Good question, huh? This pertained to the only defensive battle ever fought by Muhammad's Muslims. They were terrorists, not the terrorized. And even then, the armed civilians from Petra, Muhammad's hometown, were there to stop Muhammad from plundering them. That was the only reason they were there. The non-prophets, Ken, were actually there to defend themselves from Islam. But it did not go well. Muhammad retreated and he ran like a startled snake for cover. His followers did the same. And in the end, the clans from Petra thought that they had killed their tormentor and that they then all returned home. But that's not the story the pen wanted to write 14 billion years ago, because according to Allah, the pen wrote the Quran 14 billion years ago before even creation. That's another story, but we'll leave that nonsense for another day, particularly since there was no Quran on this day. There is more to Islam and to being a Muslim than vowing that the snake who slithered out of the garden and into the desert is God, and that the psychopath who had become a sexual pervert and mass murdering terrorist was his messenger. To be a Muslim, to be a slave to Allah, to prostrate oneself to him, to worship Satan as if he were God. The Muslim has to follow Muhammad's orders, and they have to capitulate to everything that is known about Muhammad as conveyed in the Sunnah, comprised of hadith. And Muhammad was a pedophile and a rapist. He was a mass murdering terrorist. He was a sadistic man who tortured his foes. He was an assassin. He was an avowed liar. He was as despicable a human who has ever lived. That's according to the oldest Islamic sources. As a result, Muslims act like savages who terrorized and tortured, gang raped, and sadistically mutilated, kidnapped, and murdered Jewish men, women, and children on October 7th, 2023. They followed Muhammad's example. Muslims cannot wince at death or recoil at slaughter. Terror is part and parcel of their religion. Allah says so. 33:17. Say, who is it that can protect you from Allah if he intends to harm you, or if he intends a mercy on you? And they will not find besides Allah for themselves any protector or supporter or helper. Well, it's nonsense. I'm happy to do so. Allah is no match for me or for anyone who serves alongside Yahweh. If you take the time to read the books at yadayah.com, you will be protected too. Quran 33:18. Lo, verily, Allah who knows those among you who hinder to keep from fighting in Allah's cause, and who say to their brethren, come here toward us, while they do not show up for battle, except for few. Fight as a Muslim in Allah's cause and die, or you cease to be a Muslim. It should now be obvious that all good Muslims are bad people because they fight in Allah's cause. So let it be known that Allah disdains moderate Muslims who are timid belligerents. Muslims either fight to the death, killing for Allah, or their lives are negated by Allah. And this is because Allah is, of course, inept, and he is no less irritating but more menacing than a mosquito. If he cannot beguile a Muslim into murdering for him, nothing happens. I've had thousands of death threats, and I keep on telling the Muslims the same thing. If your God is so Akbar, great. Send him after me. Surely he knows that I've written 5 volumes denouncing everything he said, proving that he is not a God. If he's so powerful, he's got to know where I am, and he certainly can do me in, right? Nah. I said, don't simply prove that I'm right and that Islam is a vicious terrorist manifesto. by doing what Allah cannot. Quran 33:19. They are, when I say they are, there's no subject and no verb, typical of the Quran, unwilling to assist you. But then fear comes. You will see them looking to you, their eyes revolving like one who faints over death. But when the fear departs, they smite you with their sharp tongues. That's what Allah is saying here, is that those who experienced Muhammad's example personally, who heard Allah's words as they were delivered for the first time, who experienced what it was to be a Muslim killer, to be a thief for Allah, recognized it was wrong. And so Allah is trying to scare them into compliance. Begrudging and niggardly towards, and only covetous of the good that comes to you. Good. Thievery, booty, rape, slaves. That's how Allah is defining good here. They are not believers, so Allah who made their deeds futile, and that is easy for Allah. So these peaceful, moderate Muslims, Allah says, no problem. I made all of their deeds futile. It's only you good terrorist Muslims, you killers, that Allah will respect and reward. 33:20. They think the clans have not withdrawn. If the allies should come, they would wish they were in the deserts among the Bedouins, seeking news about you from a safe distance. And if they were among you, they would hardly fight at all. Allah has a real problem with peaceful people. Allah demands everything from a Muslim, from their free will to their soul, their wealth and their lives. There is no being stingy or holding out on the snake. It is not enough to join the riotous processions and cheer on Allah's terrorists from afar. Good Muslims kill. That is the message of the Quran. As for Muhammad, no one was worse. In a world rife with misogynists, rapists, pedophiles, mass murderers and terrorists, liars and thieves, psychopaths and sadists, Muhammad was guilty of all of this and much, much more. He claimed to speak for God and ordered people to follow his appalling and abhorrent example. 33:21. Lo, verily, you have a noble paradigm and a good example for everyone to follow in the messenger of Allah, for him who hopes in Allah and the last day and who remembers Allah much. This noble paradigm was 66 years old. If he was in fact born when the Quran claims in the year of the elephant, when he first had sex with a 6-year-old girl, the daughter of his best friend. He had sex with his adoptive son's wife. He stole her from him. That's incest. Every time that Muhammad's men terrorized a Jewish community, Muhammad had first dibs on who to rape, and he raped them routinely. He treated women worse than dirt and told Muslims it's okay to beat them. He's the one that ordered that they walk around in tents and burqas, depriving them of freedom. He is the one whose Quran says that a woman is essentially worthless when compared to a man. He's the one who told his own family and extended kin that he was going to slaughter them. He's the one who did that at the Battle of Badr when he announced that stealing was lawful and good. He's the one that perpetrated genocide against the Jewish communities in Arabia. This is the example of a terrorist, of a mass murderer, of a sexual pervert that Allah says is a noble paradigm and a good example for everyone to follow. The messenger. If you want to know why Muslims behaved as they did on 10/7/23, is because they were following the example of Muhammad. That's why they were rapists. That's why they tortured little children. That's why they committed acts of mass murder. That's why they mutilated their victims. That's why they set them on fire. That's why they kidnapped Jews and committed grotesque acts of mass murder. They were following in Muhammad's example, and Allah says that is the example that you must follow. Quran 33:22. And when the believers saw the Confederates, the Confederates is a term that is used to describe Muhammad's family. That was the family of those who had gone to Yathrib with him. They were their brothers and sisters, their sons and daughters, their mothers and fathers. And when the believers saw the Confederates, they said, this is not what Allah promised us and his messenger. And Allah and his messenger spoke the truth. And it did not increase them except in faith and submission. Islam means submission. And in Islam, you are ordered to kill your own family. The Allied clans, as I said, were nothing but a collection of those who grew up around the Kaaba. Some may have been Christians, some monotheistic Arab converts to Judaism, and pagan Arabs from Muhammad's hometown. As his former neighbors and extended family, they were the first to hear the Quran, and they knew Muhammad better than anyone today. And yet 99.9% of the earliest witnesses to Islam not only rejected Muhammad and his Quran, they correctly assessed that Muhammad was demon-possessed, which Muhammad later admitted, that he was a fraud, forging the Quran by incorporating the stories of other people, all of which, the admission of this permeates the Quran, and it is undeniable and true. On this day, they had come to stop Muhammad from robbing, kidnapping, and killing them during his raids, and there was no army, just frustrated civilians who were finally standing up against Islam's propensity to terrorize them. They had tried appeasements, and those appeasements had failed. So that you are up to speed on the terminology, Allahu, Allahi, and Allaha mean thee for him, thee to him, and thee for her, but represent Allah. The last day and the day of doom when this is the day that disbelievers are supposed to be bodily resurrected and then tortured by the Islamic despot posing as God. The messenger was Muhammad, and he was a good example for those who prefer role models who are psychopaths and narcissists, rapists and pedophiles, misogynists and slave traders, thieves and sadists. Submission is Islam. The promise was to wage war against all mankind. All right, now that you know the terms, Quran 33:23. Among the believers are men who have been true to what they promised Allah, and among them is he who has fulfilled his vow. Among them is he who awaits, and they will not alter any alteration. 24. That Allah may reward the truthful for their truth and punish the hypocrites, disbelievers, and wrongdoers, if he once or in turn in mercy to them. Lo, verily, Allah is oft forgiving, Rahman, merciful. Yeah, merciful mass murderer, a merciful sadist that spends all of his time eternally torturing those who do not surrender to him. Yep. The believers are those who fight and kill. No alteration can there be to the Quran. There can be no moderation of Islam. The vow is to kill anyone or everyone for Allah. On this Muslim mandate, there must be no remittance or variation. It is Islam. A disbeliever is anyone who does not surrender to Allah and Muhammad as a slave, prostrating themselves to them, while venerating them as prophet and God when neither are true. Also, while Allah was capricious, do not let his oft-forgiving fool you. This snake postures himself as hell's warden, and the Lord of punishments. He isn't forgiving anyone, and he knows nothing of mercy. When we continue and consider the history of this moment, the Allied clans were not driven back. They thought they had succeeded and had taught Muhammad a lesson, so they went back home. Allah's participation that day was limited to a tempest of a whirling dervish, also known as a blowing sandstorm in the desert. Over the 23 years that his Quran was being revealed, it was Allah's only miracle. 33:25. Allahu turned back the disbelievers in their rage. They did not obtain any good or advantage. Allahu sufficed for the believers in battle. Allahu is strong and mighty. Allahu didn't do crap. Those from Babel who had come to put an end to being terrorized by Muslims simply left, just like Israel is going to do from Gaza. They did not obtain any good because they didn't put this lying piece of shit out of his misery. Allah who didn't suffice. The tormentors were nothing but overweight merchants, and they simply went back home. That is to say, they failed to recapture what these Muslims had stolen from them, and then they disengaged before the job was done. Happens often when people recognize that evil needs recompense, but then lose heart in the middle of the process. Israel, this might sound familiar to you. With Muhammad's former neighbors and extended family headed back home, the non-prophet, in lockstep with his and encouraged by his ungod, turned a covetous eye to the Jews, who had called Yathrib home for the past 1,000 years. Muhammad and Allah would set the example good Muslims emulated on 10/7/23. And this is the reason that after 22 years, I have returned to update and augment Prophet of Doom as goddamn religion. Rather than blame Muhammad for being a terrorist and mass murderer, rapist and thief, Allah blamed the Jews for the attack. It is exactly what progressives and Muslims are doing in the city streets of Europe and the United States, on college campuses, and through social media. Rather than take credit for, the blame for, rapes and tortures and mass murders and abductions, Allah then, just as Muslims and their progressive allies do today, they blamed it all on the victims. Victim shaming. It is disgraceful. Quran 33:26. I brought to this all in context because I wanted you to know that I haven't plucked this out of context. This is how horrendous Islam is. Deal with it. Don't turn your face away from it. You need to know who you just capitulated to and what they're going to do to you. 33:26. And he brought down those who backed among them the people of the scripture book from their strongholds and cast ruba, terror, into their hearts, so that a group of them you killed and a group of them you enslaved as captives. 27. And he caused you to inherit their land and their houses and their wealth and land you had not trodden. Allahu is on everything all-powerful. He's talking about genocide against God's people. He's talking about stealing their homes. He's talking about raping their women. He is talking about enslaving their children, which Muslims did. And the hadith makes it absolutely clear happened. And Allah, the ungod of Islam, is claiming credit for this. The same thing that happened on 10/7/23 happened 1,400 years prior. You are at war with Islam, whether you know it or not. And he brought down those. Now, Allah didn't do crap. I mean, He is less competent than a garden snake, but he has managed to convince Muslims that he is God and that he acted on this day when every belligerent act, every slicing off of a man's and boy's head, every rape of a woman, every child sold into slavery, every confiscation of their homes was actually an act of Allah when Muslims did it all. And they justified their horrendous act on their God and their religion. And he brought down those who backed them among the people of the scripture book, Jews, from their strongholds, and he cast Ruba, terror, into their hearts because Allah is a terrorist. So that a group of them you killed, you murdered, and a group of them you enslaved as captives. Yeah, that would be their children. Despicable. I will not allow those voices of those Jews, Muhammad, and the first Muslims assassinated be silenced. That is why I'm bringing you this message. You can listen to it and deal with it, or let them having died in vain. You want those 1,200 precious souls that Muslims snuffed out on 10/7/23 to mean something, then understand what it was that motivated the Muslims to kill them. Then, only then, can you stop this flood of Islamic terror. Only then can you make their lives count for something. Only then can you keep your government from capitulating to and rewarding this disgusting religion. Only then will you know that you can never deal with them. You can never negotiate with them. You can never turn your back on them. And that there is no such thing as a radicalized Muslim or a moderate Muslim. They're only good Muslims, and they are all killers. And he caused you to inherit their land and their home. Yeah, you stole it. Just like you want to steal Israel from them today. You stole it. And you confiscated their wealth and a land you had not trodden. And Allah is claiming credit for the thievery. He is admitting that the first Muslims stole land that did not belong to them, stole property that did not belong to them, killed people for no other reason than they were Jews, and enslaved people for financial gain. That is what the Quran just said. Can you handle the truth? Can you recognize the enemy is not Hamas? It's not Islamic Jihad. It's not Hezbollah. It's not Iran. It's not Qatar. It's Islam. It's the Quran. It's Allah. Please, wake up before it's too late. Shed your ignorance. Get a backbone, Israel. I'm willing to risk my life for you. I invested all of this time to bring you this information in the 5 volumes of Goddamn Religion. It is all documented. It is irrefutable. And I offer it all online for free and royalty free if you want the printed versions. The people of the book are Jews. This terrorist massacre took place in Yathrib, the second largest and, actually the largest and most prosperous city in Arabia at the time. Muhammad he came in as a refugee, just like Muslims are coming in as immigrants and refugees from a disgusting past in Islamic countries and infiltrating Europe. Muhammad was laughed out of town and made a mess of things in Kabaville and what was Petra. And he went to Yathrib, where within 6 years he annihilated every Jew, stole all their property, enslaved their children. Simply the truth. It was the largest and most prosperous city in Arabia at the time. 3/4 of the inhabitants were Jewish. They had made the desert bloom. What they had built was evidently worth stealing. More importantly, they had the goods on Muhammad. They knew the source of his recitals wasn't Allah because they had recited their Talmud to him. Since the last name mentioned in the 25th surah is the all-strong and the almighty Allahu, it is Allah who is claiming credit for attacking Jewish families in their homes, pulling them out into the streets, and terrorizing them. Muhammad and the first Muslims are then praised for killing the men and enslaving the women and children. Their intent was to silence Islam's critics and steal Jewish land and property. Sound familiar? And while the Quran didn't mention the systematic rape and the humiliation of Jewish women, or the mutilation of Jewish men, yes, they raped the women whose sons they had murdered, whose husbands they had butchered, cutting off their heads one at a time, 1,000 of them before Muhammad, in the very city that they had founded, in the center marketplace. And then after cutting off the heads of their sons and their husbands and their fathers, Muhammad and his goons raped them, raped their sisters, their mothers, their daughters. Surely this is beginning to resonate with you. You're going to shed your ignorance. You're going to grow a backbone. So while, as I said, the systematic rape and humiliation of the Jewish women or the mutilation of the Jewish men on this day is not chronicled in the Quran, it just speaks of the event. The Hadith goes into great detail explaining exactly what happened. This was the blueprint for October 7th, 2023, and that would make Islam responsible and relegate Hamas to nothing but a symptom. Muhammad brought the last of the Jewish tribes in Yathrib into the town square after having exiled the other two from what had been their city. Then in front of their mothers, wives, and children, Islam's prophet had his goons, the first Muslims, slowly sever every man's and boy's head, tossing them into a ditch in the middle of the town where they still remain. It's now called Medina. He and his savages raped the women and the little girls. Anyone left alive, they enslaved. Many hundreds, if not thousands of them. It was the prelude to 10/7/23, set up as a spectacle for the entertainment of Muhammad and the first and best Muslims. This is Islam, the man, the God, the book, the religion. Based upon what was just revealed and appears next, all good Muslims are terrorists. Their mission is the subjugation and annihilation of Jews. There is no other way to interpret Islam. To suggest that this religion can be moderated, to infer that jihadists are extremists instead of fundamentalists, is all to deceive. Islam cannot be reformed, controlled, accommodated, tolerated, or appeased. And please, if you're amongst the thought police, if they still exist, even after Mark Zuckerberg put them out of their misery and fired them on Facebook, even though Elon Musk claims they don't exist on X, who knows what the conditions are still on YouTube. But if you were among the thought police, this liberal cadre of deciders what can be said and cannot be said, recognize that everything I'm conveying comes from the Quran or the Islamic Hadith. This isn't my opinion. These aren't my conclusions. This is what the oldest and most respected scriptural sources in Islam say. If they're allowed to cite these books to encourage rape, murder, terror, and the annihilation of God's people, surely I can cite these books to expose them. Surely. Quran 33:36. It is not for a believing man or a believing woman to be a Muslim when Allah and His Messenger has decided or decreed a matter, that for them there should be no choice in their affairs. And whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger, he is indeed strayed into manifest error. Yahweh is the God of free will. It's essential to all loving relationships. With Allah, there is no free will. There is no choice. There can be no Islamic democracy. Islam means submission. All Muslims are slaves to Allah. He just announced there is no free will after announcing that He terrorized Jews so that Muslims could enslave them and kill them and rob them. If you're a Muslim, you have no choice in the matter. You must go along with that mindset of killing Jewish men, raping their women, enslaving their children, and stealing their property and land. The Quran attests that all good Muslims are terrorists. Further, all peaceful non-Muslims are called hypocrites by the Quran, and they cease to be Muslims from Allah's perspective and directive, which is all that matters in Islam. In addition, while every Muslim must fight everybody, the primary targets are Jews. Muslims are told to steal their homes, their property, and their land, exterminating Jewish men while enslaving their women and children. This is not an extremist interpretation of Islam. It is Islam. There is no other Islam. Quran 33:38. There is no constraint or blame on the Prophet in that which Allah has imposed and made legal for him. That has been the way of Allah with those who have passed away before. The command of Allah is the decree determined as destiny. Yes, Muhammad made this little bit up because he was a ruthless terrorist. He was a mass murderer. He was a rapist, and he was a pedophile. And they typically don't make good prophets. So he had his God say, nope, anything Muhammad does, no matter how perverted, no matter how deadly, no matter how deceitful, that is the way of Allah. In Muhammad's warped way, he somehow saw this sadistic episode as the perfect opportunity to torment his harem. So the parts of the 33rd surah that I have omitted dealt with badgering them, which is a peculiar thing for the pen to have scribed on a perfect tablet, as Muhammad's claims, as Muslims claim. Evidently, there were some people who thought pedophilia, rape, and incest were unbecoming. So Allah straightened all that out. Now you know the truth. It's time to recognize that the progressives and the Muslims decrying Jews while appealing to the religious culture that raised and indoctrinated, trained and equipped Islamic terrorists are enemy combatants and co-conspirators. The media has become more propagandist than journalistic. This is the truth, and yet they would deny it. As I have shared, even the IDF could do the even if the IDF, I should say, could do the impossible. After failing to be responsible and eliminate every Hamas leader and militant, there would be 10 more created for every martyr. It is impossible to prevail against a religious ideology with bullets and bombs. Unless that bomb is a nuclear bomb and destroys everything, but that's untenable. Not only would the radioactive fallout poison Israel, but the world's response to the death of over 1 million people would be the strangulation of Israel. You can't win this war by fighting them. As a matter of fact, as I had predicted, by Israel going into Gaza and destroying the centers of Islamic weapons caches and rockets and the like, which were in, of course, schools, hospitals, and mosques, that Israel would turn the world against them, because most people are way too stupid to know anything that I just shared with you. They're too immoral to understand accountability. And this is exactly what's happened. Israel has made a bad situation worse. So as Israel, as I predicted, would invade Gaza and attempt to eliminate Hamas by killing its leadership and militants, more soldiers will be killed in that process than the Muslims had murdered on October 7th. And it turned out that way. And to what avail? Muslims will remain to repeat the cycle. I wrote this on the morning of 10/7. It turned out to be true this morning, did it not? And to what avail? Muslims will remain to repeat the cycle, and all the while Israel will be isolated and demonized, while Jews become easier prey. It's too bad God's people didn't listen to that paragraph 15 months ago. Out of the ashes of Al-Qaeda, ISIS emerged. They were worse. Then out of the destruction of ISIS, Hezbollah gained the strength such that they are poised to bludgeon Israel. After the fall of Hamas, another name will be chosen to represent an even more zealous assemblage of jihadists. Kill them all, and there will be all the more of them. It's the magic of religion and the nature of martyrdom. This is the truth, and deep down, Israel, you know it. Frankly, while Hamas exists, they would rather rape, torture, and kill the captives than hand them over to Israel. It's already happening. Women are paraded naked and bleeding in the streets, and the soldiers were beheaded after enduring humiliation of being caged like animals. The depraved and irrational nature of this enemy makes it all but impossible to rescue them or prevent this from reoccurring. And when Jews trade innocent lives, innocent civilians who were kidnapped for convicted terrorists, the only assurance is that there will be more kidnapping and terrorism. I wrote that 15 months ago. It will come to haunt you. And when Jews trade innocent civilians for convicted terrorists, the only assurance is that there will be more kidnapping and terrorism. Reality states that Israel and the other 40 nations from which the captives hailed, including America, China, Russia, lost them because the leadership was ill-prepared and equipped to protect them. People have shirked their individual and collective responsibilities. Awash in political correctness, otherwise responsible people no longer realize that when properly directed and expressed, hate is a compassionate and necessary virtue. To discourage this from reoccurring, men and women must direct their righteous indignation against those who perpetrate and celebrate the decapitation of children and the gang rape of young girls, kidnapping and mass murder, including the religion that inspires these hideous acts against innocent young lives and whose lone founder perpetrated all of these things. Unfortunately for Israel, a population of Muslims armed to the teeth and hoping to die for the glory of the faith cannot be invaded or occupied at an acceptable or sustainable price. And trading innocent captives for convicted criminals will have the same result as what Biden wrought on Israel a month ago when he exchanged Iranian terrorists and the promise of some $6 billion for a handful of American tourists. That was just prior to the invasion when I wrote these words. To be fair, initially after the massacre, President Joe Biden transitioned from rhetoric and opposition to Israel to its most articulate and impassioned supporter. Although all was not what it seemed. When dealing with a progressive administration, America's support will come with a boatload of conciliatory concessions, which will exacerbate Israel's dire dilemma. I wrote that within a week of the onslaught of 10/7/23. I told you that while Biden was saying good things and you were all lovey-dovey, that he would be the Trojan horse and that he would exacerbate Israel's dilemma and impose a boatload of conciliatory concessions. And although you survived his presidency, when Trump came a-calling and his envoy demanded that you capitulate, you folded. I am still convinced that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has a knife against Biden's neck, and it is one that Trump also knows is there. And this psychopath is holding a senile American president hostage over the fate of petrodollars and reserve currency status. As a result, many of the prior miscalculations, America's choice is either to become a vassal of the Muslim kingdom or shrivel up and die in the ensuing catastrophic economic collapse. Trump knows it as well, which is why he sacrificed Israel while claiming credit to be the liberator of the hostages. Knowing that America has not fired a shot in the defense of Israel, and yet has spilled its blood and coin protecting Saudi Arabia, that the U.S. is bankrupt, and that its administration craves the dismemberment of Israel and the imposition of the two-state dissolution. October 7th sets the pieces in place for this eventuality. After all, why do you suppose China trumped the United States by normalizing relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and then watched as Iran made normalization between the Saudis and Israel impossible? Why was Secretary of State Anthony Blinken allowed to participate in Israel's War Cabinet meeting, where he gave directions to constrain the IDF, immediately following a meeting in Saudi Arabia with MBS? I wrote these words 15 months ago, Israel, consider yourself forewarned. You didn't heed them. Recognizing that Israel will invade Gaza, and again, recognize I wrote these words 15 months ago, realize that it will trigger an inevitable second phase of the Iranian, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad plan, with far more massive aerial assaults, followed by one with 100 times more militants, all better armed, flooding in from the north, the east, the south, and west. As a direct consequence of America's misguided fiascos in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Syria, and Libya, the assault will likely include Libyans, Jordanians, Syrians, Saudi Arabians, Iranians, Iraqis, Lebanese, and a whole host of Turkish Muslims armed with American weapons. What I didn't know then, 15 months ago, but I know now, the next assault is going to occur in 2027. It will be nearly 1,000 times worse than what happened on 10/7 of 23. And Israel, you opened the door to this in the way that you have handled yourself thus far, making yourself the pariah in the world, and then ultimately surrendering and capitulating to those who stole your sons and daughters. With America's carrier sitting offshore, as happened 15 months ago, it may be a delayed reaction, giving Iran more time to equip its proxies, and it's inevitable. Since 5,000 rockets and half that many jihadists wreak such havoc and such a savage blow, they are cognizant of what will occur when they up the ante 100-fold. Yes, Israel was very effective in putting much of the Hezbollah leadership to death. And they have spanked the Iranian Ayatollahs. But I'm here to tell you there are 2 billion Muslims. Iran will soon have their nuclear bomb. In fact, the agreement yesterday between the Iranians and Russia will assure it. This is a war, Israel, that's going to cost you millions of lives, because you have handled yourself inappropriately. You haven't listened. You've made the same mistakes over and over again. It breaks my heart to say this, but we know it's true, considering the deep-seated rage and overbearing arrogance of Muslims. If Israel opted not to invade Gaza, Israelis would be forced to cower in fear, knowing that this was the first of many such assaults. Their days would be numbered, their lives constantly at risk. And when they invade, it will result in an avalanche of hate cascading upon them from all directions. I wrote those words 15 months ago. Every word turned out to be true. Those who are informed and rational realize that Mohammed Diab Ibrahim Marie, nicknamed Dayef, the guest, the man who served as the mastermind behind the appalling events of October 7th, as the commander of the Is al-Din al-Qassam brigades of retrogrades, is the most popular political and religious figure among the Fakistinians. And Hamas, Harakat al-Muqawamah al-Islamiyah, the Islamic resistance movement, holds a 90% approval rating among the neighboring Muslim militants, with the remaining 10% favoring the other Fakistinian terrorist organization, the PLO's Fatah. As a result, recognizing that the perpetrators of this hellish plot were mostly civilians, overwhelmingly civilians, they were sponsored and celebrated by other immoral civilians in Gaza. Women's wombs became terrorist factories, and children are jihadists in training. When bloodied and beaten Jews were dragged through their streets, these same women and children gathered in great numbers and applauded. Almost everyone in Gaza is complicit in this crime, which was perpetrated by their sons at behest of their elected officials. The task of separating Hamas from the Fakistinians is as futile as removing the caustic influence of Islam from those intoxicated by it. I am sorry to say it, but these are the facts. A young viper becomes an adult viper. It does not become a pussycat. Baby Muslims grow up to be jihadist-aged Muslims. And as we learned, Muslims are bred and ordered to kill. Clearly, Israel is justified in no longer supplying the mass murdering rapists, thieves, and pedophiles who perpetrated these heinous crimes with electricity, water, fuel, or food. Supplies are confiscated by Hamas anyway. But of course, since the victims were Jews and the perpetrators were Muslims, Israel will be condemned for not feeding and fueling the aspirations of those seeking to annihilate them. It is also appropriate for Israel to raise their homes just as they would the families of much less ruthless terrorists. But do so smartly. Promise to resupply these things just as soon as every captive is returned safely to Israel and every member of Hamas walks out into the open, no longer hiding among their women and children. Tell the Muslims that you will stop attacking Gaza when every Hamas jihadist and supporter, tens of thousands of them, moves out of the populated areas into the open terrain that the Jews abandoned in the north of the Gaza Strip, where they can fight as if they were men. Offer to engage them there, giving each martyr an express ticket to Allah's brothel. Win-win. You notice what I said there? On the morning of 10/7 and 10/8, knowing what was going to occur, I encouraged Israel to send the population north, not south. I knew what was south. The Philadelphia corridor, the means to resupply through Egypt, the hiding place of Hamas. I knew that they had to move them north, but what did they do? They moved them south. It was the dumbest thing Israel could ever do. It's just astonishing that with the bravery of the individual IDF fighter, their leaders are so inept. Why did I understand what they did not? Well, Israel's paid a hellish price. Sure, Gaza is destroyed. But for what benefit? In the process, Israel has turned the world against them. Yeah, they were justified. Doesn't matter. People don't think anymore. They have no morality. They don't understand recompense. They victim shame. At the same time, Israel must fight the public perception that it is a war which, part of this war, and Israel's going to lose badly. Even in the 2 or 3 days following 10/7, it was already obvious that Israel had lost the public perception war, and it continues to get worse. No matter the pain, the autopsy and crime scene photos and description of every murdered and mutilated Jew has to be shown. All of them, along with the narrative of what occurred, showing photos of the jihadists who committed these crimes. Simultaneously, establish a photographic tribute online for all who lost their lives to these demons. While this will be both anguishing and therapeutic for friends and families, it must be done. It is the only way for their stolen lives to contribute to a better future for God's people. I wrote those words on 10/7 and 10/8/23, knowing that this is what had to be done. And still Israel refuses to do so. The cost on future Jewish lives is catastrophic as a result. I have and I will continue to devote and risk my life in support of Yehudim and Yisrael, while at the same time openly exposing and condemning the pathetic religions and political platitudes that would denigrate and destroy them, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, as well as progressives. 35 books, 10,000 radio programs, and thousands of death threats testify to my unwavering commitment, as does the 91st Mizmor Psalm. I will continue to stand up for you, but will you stand up for yourselves? Sadly, there isn't the leadership in Israel to do what needs to be done to survive. I say this because no one is willing to denounce the outright deception of a state of Palestine or the myth that there is a Palestinian people. Both lies must be bluntly and boldly rebuked to avoid the imposition of the two-state dissolution. It should become illegal, frankly, for anyone in Israel to use either misnomer. It is the plague of Hadrian revisited. The myths of Palestine and the notion of coexistence with Muslims are the most destructive and deadly for Israel. Fail in this regard, and the myth will prevail, and Israel will be lost. You, as an Israeli, must make it illegal to refer to anyone as a Palestinian or speak of a Palestine. It is an absolute lie, and by uttering those words, you are promoting the same lie. You're giving it credence, and they're using that lie to steal Israel from you and to annihilate you. And you don't have the courage to stand up against it, particularly in your media, in your academia, among your leadership, even in the IDF. Second, Muhammad's absurd lie regarding his fabled flight to the non-existent temple to meet with long-deceased Jews en route to the Islamic heaven by way of its hell must be explained and repudiated. Since it was Muhammad's response to his satanic statements, the truth is so devastating to Islam's credibility that it becomes suicidal to Muslims to persist in their claims. Both buildings, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, were initially constructed as trophies, validating Allahu Akbar, that Allah was greater than Yahweh. They emerged as the world was ravaged by the first Muslims, as they killed 1/3 of the world's population from India to Africa. Both blights on the Temple Mount must be raised with no trace of them left to inspire jihad. It should have been done in 1967. Learn and live. In this regard, if I were leading Israel, the evening of October 7th, I would announce that Muslims had 24 hours to return all 230 captives and the heads attached or severed of the 230 Muslim leaders most responsible for what occurred. Or I would remove the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque from the Temple Mount. That's what I would have done. I would have traded the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque for the lives of the 230 captives and the 230 Muslim leaders most responsible for what occurred. That's the deal I would have made. And even if they did not flinch and they insisted that they would not turn over the captives, I would have torn down those buildings and I would have told the world the farce that they actually represent. I would have told the whole disgusting story of the donkey mule ride and the lies that Muhammad told as he dreamt that he leapt from his bed where he was tormenting a 6-year-old girl. The whole lousy story following the Satanic verses. I would have embarrassed Islam. And should they have said, oh, well, we're not going to comply, the next day I would have begun to remove forcibly Muslims from Gaza, from Judea and from Samaria, by escorting them into the Sinai, to the Jordan, and into Syria. The UN, progressives, Arabs, Americans, Europeans, Russians, and the Chinese would have screamed, but that's unavoidable. No matter how Israel responds, they scream. This is the only actual solution. It is better for Israel and less lethal. While inaccurate, the complaint will be either apartheid or genocide. Those were your choices, Israel. Third, goddamn religion should be read in every Israeli home. Consider it my gift to God's people, one inspired by the God of Abraham, Yishak, and Jacob. Yes, after I had written Prophet of Doom and spent 5 years of my life on talk radio programs, risking my life to share it with the world. And then some 20 years later, as I watched the events of 10/7, and I asked the God of Islam, the God of Abraham, Yishak, and Jacob, the God of the Torah and prophets, and I said, surely, after all of this time, you don't want me to go back and augment Prophet of Doom with what we've learned along the way. That was hellish. Going into the Quran, reading the Hadith, dealing with Muhammad is like walking into hell. God, I really don't want to do that. His response to me was, I have taken care of you. Now take care of my people. This is our gift to you. There are 5 volumes. They are irrefutable. They explain exactly what happened on 10/7 and what's going to happen next. Know the truth. Tell the truth. Start responding rationally to the threat of the most lethal and anti-Semitic pandemic to ever infect humankind. The enemy is Islam. And that is rationally and evidentially irrefutable. Fourth, to survive, the enemy within must be exposed and constrained. Yeah, this will surprise you. But the greatest enemy to God's people for the last 2,000 years has been Judaism. Yahweh hates it more than Islam, more even than he hates Christianity's plague of death. Judaism has done more to impoverish Jews and separate them from their God than all other foes combined. Judaism is not just a parasite. It is on the cusp of killing the nation from within. Being Jewish is an ethnicity. It is not a religion. 70% of Israelis know that I'm right in this realization, although not to this extent, because they are not as well informed. Fifth, while people ought to be free to be stupid and to believe the abominable myths of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, conspiracy, and progressive ideology, they are not free to act upon them to the detriment of Israel and Jews. To appreciate the nation's current plight, Israel needs to be cognizant of how their forefathers behaved during the Exodus, and then become mindful of the example set by Moshe, Yahusha, Caleb, Shamuel, Dohod, Hezekiah, and Eliah. It is only when an enlightened and receptive anti-religious remnant of Yisrael returns and is prepared to meet Yahweh that there will be peace in this land. On this we have Yahweh's promise, and he has never been wrong nor failed to do as he has vowed. But be aware. Well, 10:7:23 was a wake-up call, one thus far unheeded. On May 22nd, 2026, you're going to enter the time of Jacob's troubles. And it's going to be hell on earth for Jews. Muslims and progressives the world over are going to stalk you. They're going to take your lives. They're going to take your liberty. They're going to take your dignity. They will terrorize you into submission. And this horrible time is going to last 7 years. Many millions of Jews are going to die. The prophets say it'll be the worst experience in human history, worse than the Holocaust. And only come to Towrah, which will occur on the evening of September 23rd in 2033, and then on the Shabat that follows on the 24th, that this will all finally come to an end. 10 days later, your Messiah, Dowd, will return with Yahweh, and Islam will be no more. Should you have an interest in being among those living forever in God's company, come to know him as he is, and not how the religious have slandered him, erasing his name. Should you want to become part of his family and inherit the universe, accept the 5 conditions of the Bereth covenant. Should you want to be emancipated and enlightened, enriched and empowered, read Yahweh's prescription and his presentation throughout the pages of the books bearing the Yahweh brand. Appreciate the promises pursuant to the Mikra, invitations to be called out and meet. If you want to be safe, accept David as your Messiah and Savior, your returning King. Consider these insights and countless more a gift of life and of love to Yehudim. All 35 volumes at yadayah.com are free. Your other option is to reject this advice and to continue as you have in the past, expecting a different result. Invade Gaza or not. Speak truthfully about the myths of the Palestine and Palestinian people, or give them a state from which to terrorize you. Address the root of the Islamic terrorism issue, or remain in denial as they slit more throats. Believe the rabbis, and at least you'll be dressed for your own funeral. For those who might rebuff my warning with an ad hominem assault, demeaning me by suggesting that it isn't realistic to declare war on a religion of nearly 2 billion people, I would remind you that they declared war on you 1,400 years ago. There have been countless days like today, 10/7/23, and more will come if you don't face reality. Showing compassion to the merciless damns the innocent. For those who would seek to appease Muslims by allowing them to control your Temple Mount, with these appalling trophies scarring the Jerusalem skyline as an insult to your King Daud and your Messiah and Savior, with their own territories carved out of Israel, the land that God gave to his people, I would ask you to consider how well that approach has worked in the past. Oslo comes to mind, as does the surrender of Gaza. Who wants to be the next Neville Chamberlain, I wrote 15 months ago. Now we know the answer. His name is Donald Trump. Should you choose to reject my olive branch from God because I have dared criticize the cult of Judaism, ask yourselves why condemning the Jewish propensity to be religious is the dominant theme of Yahweh's prophets. Why has life been so degrading and dehumanizing for Jews if Judaism is beneficial? Why are the most religious the least intelligent, the least productive, the least willing to fight for Israel's survival? Why are they parasites? Was Israel comatose on this day because the rabbis added their own embellishments to the mikra of Sukkah with a ninth day and then turned the Shabat into the least productive and observant time of the week? Israel, I have offered the best news possible, but not the worst. And unfortunately, it's inevitable. While Israel can and will be saved through another Hezekiah awakening, with the complete elimination of religion and a return to Yahweh, his Torah, his Mikre, and Berith, this reward is only for those willing to accept Yahweh's magnanimous offer. However, for those who choose to rebuff your religious enemies by continuing to use the weapons of war, I have some very bad news. Apart from another Hezekiah declaration on behalf of Yahweh, where Yahweh eliminated 185,000 belligerents who were going to destroy Jerusalem, you now have 2 billion of them, aided and abetted by another 2 billion libertard progressives. And there isn't a Hezekiah among you, someone who will denounce religion and return to the actual Torah, not that piece of crap that rabbis claim is their Torah, which is actually the Talmud. It is inevitable that Muslims will terrorize Israel as never before, far worse than was witnessed on October 7th, 2023. The prophets have announced it. They are never wrong. As a result of the choices and concessions Israel has made and will make, many at the insistence of the United States and Europe, the nation will become indefensible. I wrote those words on October 7th and 8th, 2023, and now they have come to fruition. Whether it is next week or next year or over the next decade, according to Yahweh's prophets, particularly Yeshaya, Israel will be overwhelmed by a flood of Islamic terrorists. I did not know that when I wrote these words, but the timing is well established. The time of Jacob's trouble begins on Shabuah in 2026. It's a May 22nd of that year, a Shabbat. And it will continue through Towrah, another Shabbat, Friday and Saturday of September 23rd and 24th of 2033, which is actually year 6,000 Yah, and the 7 years of Jacob's troubles in between. This flood of Islamic terrorists that Yeshaya and Yoel have forewarned Israel about will likely occur in the summer of 2027, with the two-state dissolution being imposed on Israel in May of 2026. But next time, rather than 2,500 to 3,000 Islamic jihadists infiltrating the Promised Land, as was the case as I wrote these words this past week, next time, with Iranian participation through Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, its occupation of Iraq, with the new terrorist gangs now in Syria and Lebanon, with Turkey calling for Israel's destruction. with Egypt back in the fray. There will be 100 times and perhaps 1,000 times more Muslims being Muslims in their pursuit of Jews. And rather than 2,000 rockets initially and 20 powered hang gliders, Israel should expect 200,000 rockets, missiles, and drones. And when that occurs, there will not be enough interceptors in the Iron Dome. There will not be enough IDF troops to protect the cities or the smaller communities. These rockets and these drones and these missiles will be aimed at Israel's largest cities, and they will be set ablaze, all while the jihadists infiltrate where Israel is the weakest, in her settlements and her smaller towns in kibbutzim. That's how it's going to play out. Now, as I foretold a year before, 10/7 of 23, the Islamic terrorists surrounding Israel will deploy the same strategy. They will overwhelm the Iron Dome with a greater aerial assault than it was designed to handle, thereby raining fire into every Israeli city. Simultaneously, this coordinated force will overwhelm the smaller and more vulnerable communities with an onslaught of jihadists. And this time, they will invade with sufficient numbers and weapons to hold entire communities hostage, leaving Israel with the impossible choice between capitulation and annihilation. There is nothing the IDF will be able to do to stop this from occurring. They didn't stop it the last time, and this is going to be between 100 and 1,000 times greater. With its tanks and jets and advanced weaponry, it is well suited to prevail in the last war, as was the case of most militaries. Should there be another Yom Kippurim or 6-day war against hostile nations and their militaries, they would prevail. But that is not the imminent danger. Israel, October 7th, 2023, is your future and your fate if you do not listen and respond appropriately. Iran now knows for certain that it can play the crazed jihadist card under the cover of fire from the sky. And as the IDF strategizes on how to keep the effects of a couple thousand crude rockets, a few bulldozers, paragliders, and a few thousand jihadists on foot and on bikes, Iran, flush with money and on the cusp of a bomb, is planning the final solution. At the very least, it will be 100-fold what God's people endured this past Shabat, and worse than before. The government and IDF will be paralyzed as Jews are raped, plundered, and annihilated. Please don't let this happen to you. No one cares more about Jews, but like Yahweh, I know your history and therefore your propensity to choose poorly and to antagonize the Almighty. And so I have devoted my life to bringing you to your senses, to helping you return to Yahweh, reintroducing his name to you, his Torah, teaching and guidance, his Moedim, eternal witnesses to the restoring testimony, his Bereth, covenant family. It's time for you to embrace the true Messiah and Son of God, Dod David, your returning king who fulfilled Pesach, Matzah, and Bekurim. He is Hamashiach. He is the Melech king. He is Yasha, Savior. And as the Zeroah, he is the sacrificial lamb who fulfilled Pesach, and he will return on Yom Kippurim, the day of reconciliations in the Yobel year 6000 Yah, sunset October 2nd, 2033. The books on the shelf at YadaYah.com, An Introduction to God, the Yada Yahowah series, Observations, Coming Home, Babel, Twistianity, and now the edition of Goddamn Religion. They're available. They're free for this purpose. That said, no one knows Islam or hates Islamic jihadists more than I have come to despise them. I understand Muhammad and Allah. I know the Quran and Hadith better than any of those who are inspiring, who these things are inspiring to jihad. Yes, I know Islam better than jihadists. Awakening you and others to this reality is why I was updating and now have updated and enhanced Goddamn Religion, turning one volume into 5, covering every surah in the Quran, every pertinent hadith, telling you the whole bloody story from beginning to end in Muhammad's own words. Yes, I know who they are. I know why they kill, and I know how to stop them, putting me in the unique position to offer these insights to you. And this, along with a newfound awareness of Yahweh, will save your country and your life. Now, one last thought before we conclude this program. I have witnessed the righteous rage of Israel, and I know what it will bring to bear against Gaza. And I have no sympathy for the Muslims who will die there, recognizing what they have sponsored and done. I watched as tens of thousands, including women and children, celebrated the terrorist acts their sons and fathers perpetrated on defenseless Jews. They are not innocent in this war, and all of the Islamic belligerents are civilians. Even children are given guns and taught to hate and kill. Nevertheless, the pictures of tears, fake and real, will hasten the next phase of this war. Rather than ridding the world of Islamic terrorists, Islam is now manufacturing them because of what Israel is doing. And they will amass in far greater numbers than they are eliminating. And just today, Israel, you capitulated. You rewarded the Islamic terrorists for stealing your lives, for abducting your children, for raping them, by giving them what they wanted. They're celebrating, and you should be in tears. Well, I appreciate you listening. I am Craig Wynn. I speak on behalf of Yahweh. And this has been my open letter to Israel. You are at war with religion. Please, wake up to the truth. Defend yourself. Come to use words wisely, because they will ultimately prevail. I thank you for listening.